Good evening and welcome to the National Building Museum. My name is Scott Kratz. I'm the Vice President for Education here at the museum. And tonight's program is the 7th in a brand new series called For the Greener Good, Conversations That Can Change the World. The goal of this series is to bring together the nation's leading experts to discuss sustainability in the built environment. It is important that these programs provide not only solutions, but also how you, the audience, can participate in creating a better future. And tonight's program, I'm really excited about, is entitled, Whose Carbon Is It Anyway? When most people think of contributors to greenhouse gases, they think of SUVs rolling down the highway, but the creation and maintenance of buildings creates over 40% of the carbon dioxide that is released into the atmosphere every year. This panel tonight will examine how we can curb the very real problem of CO2 accumulation. Who is going to take the lead for global change? Who has the authority to make the necessary changes? Do we need to think about new paradigms for environmental issues that affect the entire planet? Do nation states have a moral responsibility to one another? We've assembled an impressive panel representing a wide range of viewpoints and experiences, and I look forward to a really interesting discussion. And these discussions have been designed to incorporate your questions and thoughts. They're meant to be conversational in format. So periodically during the program, we've asked our moderator to take a break for questions from the audience. And in an effort to get in as many questions and responses as possible, I'd ask you to be as brief as possible with your questions or comments. And then at the end of the program, we invite you to continue the conversation with the participants up on stage or the audience sitting next to you during refreshments in the Museum Center Court. If you like and hear what you experienced tonight, we invite you to our next program in the series on April 22nd, which is entitled Planning for a Chinese Future. As China's economy expands at a record pace, there is growing recognition within the Chinese government for smarter growth and urban planning. This panel on the 22nd will investigate plans for the 2008 Summer Olympics to be held in Beijing and the tension between historic preservation and the creation of new green buildings. The participants will include Ma Liangwei, who's the Deputy Director of the Beijing Municipal Institute on City Planning and Design, Wang Jun, a journalist who's written extensively on preservation issues in China, Dennis Pipers, who's President of Sasaki Associates, who developed the master plan for the 2008 Beijing Olympics, and Paul Goldberger, the architectural critic of The New Yorker, will moderate this panel. The For the Greener Good series is presented by the museum's sustainability partner, the Home Depot Foundation, and we would like to thank them for their generous support of this innovative lecture series. And before we begin, can we get a quick idea of who is in the audience? That always helps the panelists up here have an idea of who they're speaking to. Raise your hands if you're architects. Great. Planners. Great. Landscape architects. Wonderful. Engineers. Journalists. Wonderful. Students. That's great. Federal or state employees? Wonderful. Did I forget anybody? Who did I forget? Regular people? We're all regular people, right? Okay. I'm sorry? Environmentalists. Developers. Developers in the audience. Excellent. Great. To begin tonight's program, we're taking a little break in tonight's format. We've invited a very special guest to give us a local perspective on tonight's program and how Washington, D.C. is working to mitigate greenhouse gases and serve as a potential model for other cities across the United States. Harriet Tregonig was confirmed as director of the district's Office of Planning in February 2007. Prior to this, she was the director of the Governor's Institute on Community Design and co-founder with former Maryland Governor Glendening and executive director of the Smart Growth Leadership Institute. She developed her expertise in state-level action in the state of Maryland, where she served the governor as both Secretary of Planning and then as the nation's first state-level cabinet secretary for smart growth. Prior to her tenure in the Maryland state government, she was the Director of Development, Community, and Environment at the United States Environmental Protection Agency. At the EPA, she helped to found and coordinate the National Smart Growth Network, a national partnership program designed to inform and accelerate innovative smart growth policies and practices. Please join me in welcoming Harriet Tregonig.
Thank you, Scott. I really am honored to be here this evening and to get a chance to talk a little bit about Washington, D.C., the city that you're in right now, and how we think the issues of climate change are going to loom particularly large for our city, and how a lot of the actions and investments that we're undertaking right now are really all about making Washington a terrific place to live and work in a world that's increasingly going to be denominated by carbon and pounds of carbon. So let me tell you a little bit about that. Some of you might know that at the end of 2006, Washington passed the most ambitious green building law of any municipality in the country. And our intention was that in passing this law that we would have the public sector lead and do the market making. And the private sector wouldn't have to comply with the green building requirements for 5 years. We've been astonished to see the private sector leap out ahead, and now 4 years before they're required to do so, we have more than 200 green buildings in the pipeline in Washington, D.C., more than any other city in the U.S. Every one of those dots is a LEED certified or LEED registered project. We actually have 8 LEED neighborhood development projects, a pilot that looks at development on a larger scale than a single building in Washington, D.C. I've been told that the entire state of Florida has only 6 projects registered. So we're really trying to be at the forefront of green when it comes to buildings. But as Scott mentioned, buildings are very significant, but if you put buildings and transportation together, that we're really talking about the lion's share of CO2 emissions. And buildings alone, as you know, aren't the answer. And in Washington, in particular, we've really tried to recognize that so many of the trips that people take every day are really short trips. Half the trips that are taken are 3 miles or less. Something like 25% of the trips, 28% are less than a mile. And 75% of those trips less than a mile in this country are taken by car. So a city like Washington has the opportunity to capture a lot of short trips by bike, by transit, by walking, and we're increasingly looking at ways to make it inviting for people to take those alternatives. In fact, when we think about Washington and we think about our future, we really define our attributes and our aspirations in terms of what will make us a globally competitive city in the future. What are those qualities that are important to invest in now that are going to be increasingly critical to our competitiveness? Certainly distinctive neighborhoods and districts where it's very pleasant to live, very pleasant to work. You have every convenience and every amenity at hand, but it's also having great transportation choices, multiple options, and having an urbanity, a scale that's very human, which is unique to our city. All of our buildings, we actually have built into this the height standards for Washington an urban design principle that our streets dictate how high our buildings will be. The right-of-way plus 20 feet dictates the height of our buildings. So distinctive neighborhoods, including 30 miles of waterfront along the Anacostia that we're essentially just rediscovering and developing along, but also new modes of transportation. We're fortunate to have Metro, but we recognize that for all the different types of travel that visitors and residents of Washington want to take, that subway is really not enough. So we're bringing the streetcar back to Washington. This is our actual streetcar on the streets of Prague being tested. And we hope to have it in operation here very soon. This is a sample of what some of the additional transit routes look like as we look to add additional transit service in the city. But we also want to provide a really diverse transportation setting for all those green buildings that are coming up. We're very fortunate to have car sharing in this city. We have more than 700 zip cars in 26 neighborhoods, which makes it possible for a lot of Washington residents to say, you know what, I can have the convenience of an automobile without having to own one. Isn't that great? We're bringing Paris's bike sharing system to Washington next month. We're going to start a little less ambitious than Paris, I think 120 bikes initially at 10 kiosks, but the same sort of system. You join a club, swipe your card, and off you go. And we're really looking forward to that. walkable urbanity, as I mentioned before, we're really investing in the quality of places, the public realm, the walkability, in some cases by adding convenient destinations like shopping, like grocery stores in particular. You might have noticed that they're popping up all over the city in places that have never had those kinds of conveniences before. And that's because we want people to be able to walk or get very conveniently to meet all their daily needs without having to invest necessarily in auto-oriented transportation. I'm sorry. Some of the places that are walkable in the city, and thank you very much. I look forward to this evening's conversation. I hope we get to hear a little bit about green buildings and transportation from our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet. Tonight, actually before I begin, one quick plug, starting in October of 2008, the museum will open up a brand new exhibition called Green Community that deals with the past, present, and future of green communities, of which DC and all of the great work that Harriet and her staff are working on will be prominently featured. So we hope you come on back and see that in October. Now tonight, I will introduce the moderator for the evening, who will then in turn introduce our distinguished panel. Juliet Eilperin is a journalist at the Washington Post, where since April of 2004, she has covered the environment for the National Desk, reporting on science, policy, and politics in areas including climate change, oceans, and air quality. She joined the Post in March of 1998 as its House of Representatives reporter, where she covered the impeachment of Bill Clinton, lobbying, legislation, and 5 national congressional campaigns. In the spring of 2005, Roman and Littlefield published her first book, Fight Club Politics: How Partisanship is Poisoning the House of Representatives. Her book has been featured on several radio and television shows, including Comedy Central's The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross. She is currently working on a book on sharks to be published in the spring of 2009 by Knopf Pantheon. Please welcome Juliet, who will in turn introduce our distinguished panel. If we can invite the entire panelists to come up at this point, that'd be great.
Welcome. We have a great panel tonight, so I'll briefly introduce them, and then we're going to start out with one question for each of our panelists, and then we'll open it up to a broader discussion. Over there at the end, Rainier Hascher is the principal of Hascher Jehle Architektur. He was the chairperson of the European Conference for Solar Energy and Architecture and Urban Planning, and is a professor of architecture at Berlin University. His key commissions, of which he'll be talking about tonight, include the Stuttgart Museum of Art, the Bosch Center, and the Darmstadt Congress and Science Center. Then Scott Barrett, who's right here, is a professor of environmental economics and international political economy, director of the International Policy Program, and director of the Global Health and Foreign Policy Initiative at SAIS. His research focuses on interactions between natural and social systems, especially at the global level. Natural systems, such as climate or the ecology of a pathogen, tend to be unified. By contrast, the international system, which, as we all know, is incredibly divisive and comprises some 200 states, is highly fragmented. And his research focuses on the institutions that mediate between those two worlds. And examples of those include the Kyoto Protocol, which was aimed at mitigating global climate change, and resolutions passed by the World Health Assembly, including those aimed at eradicating polio. He is probably best known for his work on international environmental agreements, for which he received the Eric Kemp Prize, and had a book on the subject, Environment and Statecraft, The Strategy of Environmental Treaty Making, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2003. And his latest book is Why Cooperate? The Incentive to Supply Global Public Goods, which was also published by Oxford just in the September of last year. And we will be talking about that in terms of a range of issues and focusing on climate change and again, what is the potential and obstacles that stand in the way of cooperation on that level. Then Melissa Lavinson is sitting next to Scott. She's Director of Federal Environmental Affairs and Corporate Responsibility at PG&E Corporation. And in terms of that, she focuses on environmental and climate-related issues at the federal level and serves as the project manager for PG&E's Corporate Responsibility Report. She joined PG&E's Corporate Environmental and Federal Affairs Organization in 2003 from National Energy and Gas Transmission, Inc., where she was responsible for developing and coordinating public policy positions and public strategies for NEGT's External Affairs Department. And so she can enlighten us on exactly what it takes to talk to people in Washington and policymakers in dealing with climate change. And PG&E was an instrumental player in the work that Fran Pavley has done, who's sitting right there. Fran Pavley served 3 terms in the California State Assembly. And she is best known for the law that bears her name, which I write about frequently, the Pavley Bill, otherwise known as AB 1493, which is the law that's been adopted by 17 states as well as parts of Canada in regulating tailpipe emissions and specifically carbon dioxide from cars, which aims to reduce tailpipe emissions 30% by 2016. And that's a bill that, as many of you know, again, many states are eager to adopt, but is temporarily being blocked by the Environmental Protection Agency and will be the subject of litigation and resolved in the courts. And in addition, before leaving office because of term limits, she was the author of the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, which is the first in the nation carbon cap, economy-wide carbon cap, and that's one of the things that we'll be talking about. And right now, she works as a senior climate advisor for the Natural Resources Defense Council. So those are the people who will be talking tonight. And we're going to start with Professor Hascher. And I'd like to ask you that, given that the creation and maintenance of buildings creates over 40% of greenhouse gases that are released into the atmosphere each year, what are European architects and designers doing to incorporate green design into their everyday work?
First, I have to apologize that I will read these because my English is not good enough to speak free. So I prepared something. Thank you very much. Meanwhile, we know that energy saving is not simple done. It is a very complex theme. There are no simple rules to solve the problem. It is not enough to insulate the houses. Even sometimes, insulation, if it is too thick, is counterproductive in summertime. Too different are the demands of the various functions of buildings. A laboratory is not an office building. A museum is not an hospital. For these different functions, you cannot propose the same means to save energy. Too different are the influences of the special climates, especially of the microclimates, influences of the level of the groundwater, strength and directions of the wind, humidity, conditions of the ground, the flora, and so on, allow not to solve the problem in a direct and very simple way. Too different are also the methods we know today to control the household, the balance of energy in only one simple way. We have nowadays an enormous sum of methods to control the energy balance of a house. Some examples: insulation for sure, but also buffer zones, earth collectors, geothermal storage, phase-changing materials, solar cooling systems, photovoltaics, adiabatic cooling, wind power, earth channels, energy activating of masses of concrete by water pipes, water solar collectors, and so on and so on. So we have to research from the beginning of planning all these possibilities. The first aim is to minimize the consumption of energy. The second aim is to optimize the share of the renewable energies. For an optimal energy performance for a building, we have to change our planning process. The right way is not a linear process like in former times. when the architect designed the figure and the shape of the building, and later on the engineers develop the structure and the house technique. What we need nowadays is a real team working between the architect and all the engineers from the beginning, from the first sketch. This we call an integral or integrated planning process. It's not linear, it's an iterative process. This planning process needs more expense because we work there with complex computer simulations, with wind channel tests and tests for airflows. It means also higher planning costs for the client. But he will gain back the money in saving energy in the next years. And the return of investment is much higher than the costs. You can normally say that the running costs of an office building are after 7 years higher than the investment costs. Let me show you now the result of such a team planning process between architect and engineers. On the right-hand side to me, you see not fair halls, not sports halls, it's an office building with about 100 and 300 working stations for 1,800 employees. Less working stations than employees. The principle of the clean desk is an important design for this factor. Each employee has to seek for each new working day a new working station he has not his own. 30% of the employees are out of the house. They speak with the client, they work at home, they have holidays, they are sick, they are trainees on trainees. So we build 30% less house. And the running costs are 30% less, and of course, 30% less emissions. Second, the building is only 4 stories high. On the second floor runs the main mall through the whole house, where the employees enter the house. By feet, they go from this level maximum 2 stories higher or deeper. So we saved 8 elevator groups in the house and a lot of electrical energy. Only on the back side are some for services. The offices are built in an economic camp structure. You see here this camp structure. Only 12 to 14 meters in the depth. So we could gain excellent conditions for daylighting. You must know that 1/3 of the energy consumption for an office building normally is spread for artificial lighting. But a problem of this good daylighting is a long wind off of the facade and the loss of heating energy in wintertime. You see, sometimes, not only sometimes, often, the demands are in contradiction. So we put on the second coat, in form of 3 glass halls over the calm structure. You see it here. They show directly to the south. So the glass halls collect in wintertime passive solar energy. So without heating inside this buffer zone, we have about 6 to 8 degrees Celsius higher temperature than outside. The offices are all natural ventilated to these warmer halls. The fresh air is so naturally preheated. The rest of the heating is only done by water pipes in the concrete ceilings. A small energy power station combining electricity and heating is providing energy for the building totally decentral. So we have less lag in conducting energy and an excellent use of primary energy consumption. What you see is not a rigid office block. It is more an open communication landscape with high-quality workstations. You see there, such of a workstation. With their laptops, people also work in the green halls and meet for project meetings on these communication islands, you see here, under the umbrellas. The mall is accompanied by cafeterias, shops. Yeah, you can get cut there, also your hair. So it is functioning like a small village. In the same way, we gain in wintertime solar energy. We have naturally in summertime a problem with the sun. There is a danger of overheating the house. If you cool down the inside rooms by air conditioning, you lose all your gains of wintertime. It is counterproductive because you would spread now in summertime more energy for cooling than for heating in wintertime. This is such of one complex problems where you need the creativity of an engineering teamwork. We are cooling the house by the same water pipes in the concrete ceiling as for the heating in wintertime. This is much more efficient for energy than cooling by air, because the water in the pipes of the ceilings is cooled by the groundwater. This site, and that's a specific microclimatic thing, this site had the advantage of a high level of groundwater. But this effort is not enough to cool the house in summertime. So we used a row of other means, for example, adiabatic cooling by the artificial lake you see in front here, in front of the house. The wind coming the most time from the southwest. You see here the house, it is more than 380 meters long, and the main wind direction is the southwest from here. Also a specific microclimatic thing. The wind is stretching over the water and the air cools down approximately 1.5 to 2.5 degrees of Celsius before he enters the halls. That's a lot in summertime, and if you go later on to the spring fountain there, you will find the same effect here in the house. To research whether the whole halls are optimally ventilated, we tested the airflow by a wind channel. You see it here, it's the University of Zurich in Switzerland. There the wind comes out, and in front you see a platform, a round platform, where a model with 3 meters length is sited. And so we can turn around this platform, and from this comes the wind. Inside there are measure points, so we can exactly measure what will happen inside this hall. For these tests, winds with a higher speed are not the problem. Only winds with less speed than 6 meters per second are the problem, because they cannot penetrate the whole halls if we do not design a good airflow. The computer simulations showed that we need, against the flat sun in the morning and evening time, these glass panels you see here at the edge of the halls for the sun protection. We optimized the geometry of the glass roof for the airflow you see here. And we did it with the wind channel, and we tried a lot of efforts to optimize the shape of this classroom that it is very good ventilated. The costs of this wind channel tests are only an insignificant amount as we could save for the steel structure of the roof, because the light roof was calculated with the real measurements of the existing wind speeds, which are on the side lower than legal standards. Computer-controlled glass panels can be opened during the summertime on the whole length of the facade. That's the facade, and the whole length, over 330 meters, can be opened in this way you see here. With this instrument, you can control the airflow efficient. In the summertime, you don't have anymore a glass hall. You only have a roof, because the facades surrounding the house are totally opened. The systems of controlling all elements by computers, dependent on temperature outside, inside, airflow, and so on, are nowadays a very important factor for saving energies. All working stations have the same qualities for each employee. All look into the green garden, all have a balcony or a terrace. Nature and working places are woven to a symbiosis. In this case, natural ventilating has more comfort than an overregulated air conditioning installation. So, architectural form can also be developed in a team of architects and engineers from the first step, from the beginning. In future, the architectural form will be also an expression of ecological targets.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Professor Barrett, we want to talk a bit about your book, Why Cooperate, and the prospects for international cooperation. I have to say that I was lucky enough to report on the climate talks in Bali in December, which I found were so profoundly dysfunctional that they made the Congress, which I've written about for years, seem like a model of civility and effectiveness. So I thought you could talk a little about why you think, what do you see as either the potential or the obstacles to having international cooperation on global warming in light of the difficulties we've seen in recent months and years?
There were a lot of sharks around Bali too, I think, right?
There are.
Okay.
There are. I did not go diving while I was there, however.
Well, some of them are in the conference halls too, though. Climate change really is the most difficult challenge the world faces. And what makes it difficult is that some of the choices are hard, and there has been a lack of leadership. We know that here, but it's also true that in other places there has been rhetoric, but not followed by strong actions. The difficulty of climate change is it's a little bit like trying to row a boat, where you need to have everyone with an oar chip in for the boat to move fast. And the problem is that a lot of people in this particular boat are waiting for other people to do the rowing, and so the world is really not making any progress at all. A little historical perspective, the first international meeting was actually in 1988 on climate change in Toronto. It was a quasi-political meeting, so a bit like Bali, a little less formal. The first meeting, 1988, and all the parties there agreed by consensus that the world should reduce carbon dioxide emissions 20% from the 1988 level by 2005. Well, from there until 2005, emissions have increased more than 30% globally. So what that means is the target that was set in Toronto in 1988, we've already missed it by 50%. And why is that? There are a lot of reasons for that. Again, this is the hardest problem, but if you're going to have a treaty that succeeds, it's really got to achieve three things. The first is it's got to have wide participation. Second is it has to get the countries that participate to do what they said they're going to do. And the third thing is it has to get the countries to agree to do something very significant. You have to understand that with climate change, it's only global emissions that matter. The climate only pays attention to global emissions. And if you want to stabilize concentrations at any kind of level, it doesn't even matter what the number is, eventually you have to bring down emissions to zero. So you need to have a total transformation in our economic system, and it has to be global. And what we have with the Kyoto Protocol is the first formal attempt to really do this. We have participation is not full. The United States, most importantly, is not a party to that treaty. Now, you might think the United States is the exception, but there are other countries like China that are parties, but they're parties because they're not required to do anything. Remember, there are these three things that a treaty has to do simultaneously. A country that will fail to comply is Canada, which is a nice country. It's a great country. It's a country that respects international law, but it looks like Canada will probably exceed its Kyoto targets by around 40–45%, which is amazing. And they are not going to comply. And finally, the Kyoto Protocol really asks all these countries to do very little. It only asks them to cut back by about 5% for a period of just 5 years, a very modest kind of effort. So the system we have so far hasn't really worked, and I think the first thing we need to do is understand that, understand why, and then move on to try to come up with a better approach.
Excellent. Okay. And now, Melissa, we'll move a little bit to the domestic challenges that lie before us. Obviously, working for PG&E, one of the things that your utility has joined is the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, which obviously has endorsed the idea of a nationwide cap on carbon emissions. And I was wondering both if you could talk about what specifically U.S. CAP is trying to achieve at this moment, given what's been happening in Congress, and also what are the roles that you think utilities will play in the fashioning of any nationwide limit on greenhouse gases, particularly given how deeply divided the utility industry is on this issue?
Thanks. Well, yes, we did. We were one of the founding members of the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, which was launched in January of 2007. And it was founded by a group of leading businesses and environmental NGOs. And when we came together, and we worked for about a year on developing a set of guiding principles and recommendations for federal legislation. And what really brought us all together was a recognition that ultimately climate is a global problem requiring a global solution, but the only way we're going to get there is if the U.S. steps up and shows leadership, and that we really need to have a national approach to addressing greenhouse gases. And we all recognize that we felt that the best way to do that was to pursue market-based approaches, and the cornerstone of that would be a cap-and-trade program. And the guiding principles that we came out with and the recommendations all really neatly wrap up into sort of three overarching tenets. One, which is a bill needs to be environmentally effective, it needs to be economically sustainable, and it needs to be fair. Now, those are easy things to say, and those are hard things to achieve, and I think we're seeing Congress right now working to do that, particularly on the Senate side as they work through legislation. U.S. CAP is really focused on moving legislation as quickly as possible through the Senate that meets these overarching, through the Congress that meets these overarching principles. So we are working cooperatively. We've grown our ranks from 14 to now 33 diverse organizations. We are up there working with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle and anybody who's interested in talking about what we think will help make an environmentally effective, economically sustainable, and fair climate change bill. Our objective is really to educate and to be provided as a resource for Congress as they move forward. And so that's what we're really focused on right now. In terms of the utility industry, you're right, the utilities we are not monolithic. We have divergent points of view depending on what our resource mix is, depending on the customers we serve, depending on what part of the country we come from. But I think there's a recognition that climate change, and particularly in the U.S., utilities are going to have to play a role. PG&E recognizes that. We're 40% of the problem in the U.S. in terms of CO2 emissions. We have a responsibility to step up. We have a responsibility to come forward with effective solutions, and that's something that we've been focused on as a company, and we think some of the real big pieces of that are going to be a real focus on energy efficiency and demand response, and really looking at those next generation technologies in terms of power generation, and also to provide that infrastructure to support some of these new exciting technologies, not just on the generation side, but on the end-use efficiency side as well. We really are the backbone of the energy industry, and if you're going to look at advanced transportation solutions like plug-in hybrids, if you want to look at smart end-use appliances, if you want to look at distributed generation, you're going to have to work with the utility companies to do that, and really it needs to be a cooperative process, and that's something that we're really focused on.
Excellent. Assemblywoman Pavley, I was wondering, obviously, as the author of Global Warming Solutions Act, you established a cap on greenhouse gas emissions to have it at 1990 levels by 2020, which is a 25% reduction, and then with far more ambitious goals reaching out to mid-century. Can you talk about how California plans to meet these ambitious reductions and to what extent this is realistic?
Yes, I'd be glad to talk about that. And this bill got through the process and signed into law in 2006, mostly by Democrats in the legislature, and our Republican governors likes to refer to himself as a climate action hero. And he's been very good on this particular topic. We have a variety of strategies in place. California has been somewhat unique because we've had some programs in place where we've already begun those reductions. We've had a renewable portfolio standard, a target of 20% of all our energy come from renewable wind, solar, and geothermal, about a 20% part of it by the year 2010 or 2011, or at least the contracts will be. And PG&E and other utility companies are going to meet those objectives. That's been in place for years. We have an Energy Commission who's done a wonderful job on setting energy efficiency standards for appliances. In fact, in California, our per capita consumption on energy has stayed pretty much level for the last 25 years, while the rest of the country's been going up. We're catching up on green building designs. I was very intrigued with the gentleman from Germany. We have a long way to go, but we're seeing more and more new buildings in cities meeting those standards, because energy efficiency is not only good for the environment, but what business leaders are realizing it's good for their bottom line, and so that's in place. We also have a Public Utilities Commission who, and maybe you can explain it better than I, but in California we have decoupling, where investment in renewables and energy efficiency come first in load orders before you increase your energy supply. And some states now are engaged in that. We've had in place for years in California a registry program where emitters of greenhouse gas emissions can actually measure their carbon footprint and establish a baseline. And that was very smart of them to get engaged in this process, because under AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, there is now a mandatory reporting requirement that is in place, and it's enforceable and is in the law in California. And so they have a baseline, and so the goal is that businesses that are doing the right thing and are actually beginning the process of reducing their carbon footprint will be getting credit under this new system in place. The next couple of years are going to be key in California. We've had a broad stakeholder approach to this, environmental justice community, the business community, the environmental community, the health community, to figure out how to do this. We know it's just a midterm target, that 25% by 2020, but we feel we can do this. And one thing that's key in California is about 38 to 40% of all our greenhouse gas emissions come from mobile sources, from automobiles and light-duty trucks. We have 25 million cars in California, and so the passage of the AB 1493, the tailpipe emission bill that's subject to the EPA waiver, is critically important to California in meeting those reductions targets as envisioned in AB 32. I should point out, just on a political note, California's had 53 waivers in a row passed by the Environmental Protection Agency over the last 3 decades, because California can pass under the Federal Clean Air Act more stringent air emission standards than the federal government. We've had 53 passed by the EPA. None have ever been denied till the one that was denied on December 19th of last year. So that's an important piece of the puzzle, but the biggest effort underway in California is to get this right. Should it be a command and control kind of approach to require the reductions? Should it be market-based mechanisms, or should it be a combination of strategies? How far can California go by itself while we wait for a federal government and a federal policy to be put in place? And all this is very much alive and subject to discussion in Sacramento.
Excellent. And Dr. Hascher, I have one question for you, picking up on the issue of renewable energy, which Assemblywoman Pavley was just discussing. Now, Germany has its own mandate of 20% renewable energy by 2020, as well as some locked-in prices for energy produced by photovoltaics, which has encouraged enormous growth in both solar and wind power industries. And I know a lot of politicians in Washington have been looking at that model, and I was wondering if you could talk a little about how well it's working or where there are areas where that is still a challenge for Germany.
Yes, we are still also at the beginning, I must tell. We try, but I think it's really a chance also. It's a model in my eyes for the United States. The potential of solar power and wind power and water power of the USA is, in my eyes, an enormous amount higher than in the narrow country of Germany. You can use here renewable energies much better and more efficient than in Germany. You can go the way of producing a lot of energy near to the consumer. And that's the best way to save primary energy. And this way we have to go all over the world. It's the only way. But I think we can save a lot of energy, not all, sure, for sure we need central energy producing, but about 30 to 40% I think can be saved by saving energy and producing energy near to the client. These both parts are the points for the future.
Excellent. Now I thought maybe we could open it up to questions from the audience. And again, obviously I can pose questions, but we're all interested in hearing what audience members want to ask these panelists. So I guess I'll just go ahead. Do we have microphones for the, I don't know if we have microphones. We're getting them. Yes, I will, in the interim, I will repeat. If you could go ahead and I'll.
This is directed to the lady from PG&E.
Okay.
I'm familiar with the term ecological sustainability, but not.
So it was a two-part question, with the first part being the questioner is familiar with the concept of ecological sustainability, but not economic sustainability. So the question is, what does that entail, and where does PG&E envision itself in terms of alternative sources of energy, and what can be brought up to scale to be applied on a broad level? So that's from Melissa Lavinson. She'll answer that.
Well, when USCAP discussed its principles and recommendations, one of the pieces that we recognized was what we're really talking about is a paradigm shift in our economy. We're really talking about a fundamental change in the way energy is produced, consumed, and delivered both in the US and globally, and that's the way we're going to meet this challenge. And so what that's really going to require is a transition throughout our economy of doing things differently. We're not going to be looking at the technologies of 30 years ago. We're going to be having to identify and move to the technologies of 30 years from now. And so we're going to need, a different type of workforce. We're going to have different solutions for our industries. We're going to have to advance energy efficiency, advance alternative energy, and this is going to require a transition period. And so in order for a program we believe to be environmentally effective, vis-a-vis what it means is, meet its environmental goals over this 20, 30, 40, 50-year period, which we're suggesting, a 50-year program, it has to last for that period of time. And if the program starts out very quickly and is very environmentally aggressive and doesn't recognize the transition that's going to occur to meet those aggressive goals, it's not going to be sustainable. The program, politicians are going to step in and say, this is not okay, we can't let this happen. So we recognize that there's going to be a transition for the economy, and what's going to be needed is to help manage that transition so that we can move from where we are today as quickly as we possibly can to where we need to be so that we can meet those long-term emission reduction targets. And what USCAP was talking about was somewhere between a 60 to 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from today's level by 2050. And if you think about that tremendous type of change, particularly in the utility industry, where we really are using technologies of 60, 70 years ago, I mean, we have some hydro facilities that are 100 years old. That's a lot to get done in a very short period of time. For PG&E, what we're looking at, we're very optimistic about the future, and we're doing a lot in our service area and a lot with our company, and we're taking a very holistic approach to this. we've already done a tremendous amount of energy efficiency. I'm not sure who that is. Over the, as Assemblywoman Pavley was discussing, in California, we've really led the way on energy efficiency as a state. And for PG&E, what we've done is we've managed to save over the past 25 years of our programs about 135 million tons of CO2 avoided, which is a tremendous amount. We've saved our customers about $22 billion in the process and avoided the need to build about 25 power plants. We've done a lot, but we see a lot more that we're going to do. So we have a great emphasis on energy efficiency and an emerging technologies program. We're looking at alternative sources of energy to meet the renewable standard. We're looking at wave technology. We're looking at biogas technology, tidal technology. We are very bullish on concentrating solar power. We're really looking at those. And we're really looking at the infrastructure to support all these great new technologies that are coming. It's wonderful to have these great end-use technologies or these great new generating technologies, but if you can't get the power to the people or you can't really optimize some of these end-use technologies, then you're not really solving the problem. So we're looking at an advanced meter program that provides two-way communication so we can use the smart end-use appliances, so that we can do demand response, so that we can facilitate plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So we're really looking at this holistically as what can we do as an energy company to provide great service to our customers and do it in a very environmentally sustainable way.
Okay. Do we have other questions out there? Sorry, it's a little hard to see with the lights, but out there in the back. Can you wait for 1 moment because we can get a mic to you and that'll be easier.
My question is to the professor from SAIS, but first to reference Germany's pledge to reduce emissions, I believe 20% by 2020, but with a simultaneous pledge to take nuclear offline in about 8 years. It doesn't seem like they're going to be able to comply with that goal. As has also been mentioned, Canada is going to fall short of their Kyoto targets, as probably Japan will as well. Supposing there is an ideal successor agreement to Kyoto established in Copenhagen, what is a realistic penalty regime that's going to be instituted in a parallel fashion with that agreement?
Okay, so maybe Professor Barrett could take it, and then Professor Hascher, if you want to talk about it too.
Yeah, let me just explain why. This is a great question, and it really cuts to the heart, I think, of the problem. Let me explain. Let me give an example of a penalty regime that works, and I think once people see that, they'll see the difficulty with climate. I think it was 2003, either that or 2002, the United States imposed tariffs on imports of steel. The European Union brought the U.S. to the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization convened a disputes panel on this. The panel ruled that the U.S. action was illegal. It was inconsistent with the treaty that the United States has signed up to. And under that arrangement, the United States was asked to take down its tariffs. It did not. Well, the WTO allows the country that brings the case, and this is Europe in this case, to impose rebalancing efforts against the United States. And so Europe looked to tariffs that it could apply, and it has some flexibility of what it chooses. So this was this was close to the 2004 election, and the Europeans actually chose to impose tariffs on orange juice. You might remember Florida was rather important for the earlier election, so they have this discretion of where they impose the punishments. And it was really on the eve of the United States about whether the United States should remain a party to the WTO. Mechanism that works. By the way, one reason it works so well is that it didn't have to be applied. That's actually the ideal. It's the threat that is sufficient to really change behavior. Now with climate change, there is discussion today about using trade arrangements to have similar impact. And one reason for that is that as one country or one group of countries cuts back on emissions, what happens is you're pushing up costs for industry within that territory, and that shifts comparative advantage in international trade towards other countries. And so as a direct result of one country trying to do the right thing for the world, you can actually get an increase in emissions elsewhere. And one proposal is that you want to impose something called border tax adjustments to try to create that, to correct for that differential. But these turn out to be incredibly difficult to calculate. You would, for example, have to work out this glass, if this was to be traded, you'd have to work out the greenhouse gases that were released in the manufacture of a product like this, and you'd have to do it for every product. And so that's a formidable practical challenge. There are also deeper issues. I'll just mention one more, and that is legitimacy, in the sense that who has the right to say what other countries ought to do, and therefore against whom trade restrictions of this kind, or even blunter and cruder instruments, should be applied. And just to give you one sort of taste for this, when Britain brought the issue of climate change to the UN Security Council, a lot of other countries became very upset because they didn't like the idea of a small group of countries imposing an outcome upon others, and then, of course, enforcing that outcome as well. So the problem you pointed to really explains why we've had so little progress so far. And although what I've been saying is not very uplifting, I hope it gives you a sense for just how great this challenge is and why it's different from some other ones.
And Professor Hascher, can you talk about how Germany is meeting this challenge of deciding to phase out nuclear power at a time when American politicians are talking about increasing that power?
Yes. I'm not an expert in energies, but I'm only an architect, but as I think we will not reach this target without nuclear power. And it's a matter of politics in the moment, because one party demanded to put down the nuclear power, but I think in a few years we will have it again. I'm sure.
Excellent. Is there other questions from the audience? Why don't we take one on this side? Okay. Go ahead.
Please allow me to challenge the premise that action need cost. Certainly the recent McKinsey study of carbon and technologies show that a vast amount of efficiency would be at less cost than the supposed economic equilibrium we're at today. And the public policy perspective that all change need involve incremental cost is a question of timing and scale, not an integrated approach at all. Thank you.
Would anyone want to speak to the fact of maybe we get to the issue of, ultimately how hard is this for policymakers to do because of different sectors of the economy being affected in different ways? Maybe we could put it that way to Assemblywoman.
Well, as being one of the sponsors of the McKinsey study, actually we helped fund that, and we're involved in that. You're absolutely right. The McKinsey study shows lots of negative cost options to start to, as you move down that cost curve, and efficiency is one of them. And as I indicated, PG&E in California have really pushed the envelope on efficiency. And even though we've pushed it so far, we still believe that there's a lot more to do very cost effectively. And if we believe there's a lot more to do cost effectively in California, then clearly there's a lot of untapped energy efficiency nationally. And what the McKinsey study showed was the potentials that are available for energy efficiency. What stands in the way of those, realizing those potentials, are regulatory and market barriers, and that's where the policymakers come in. And that's where, as I indicated earlier, what we're talking about is a paradigm shift. And so it's thinking differently and putting in place those policies that will help us achieve those potentials. And so you're right, we're of the mind that we can get started today. We can meet aggressive near-term targets that are being talked about at the federal level if we put in place the right policies to help us realize those potentials that exist. Over the longer term, to meet some of those future reductions, we are going to really have to come up with new technologies. And there are going to be costs associated with them. But at the same time, we believe that if you put in place the right approach and the right policies and that right transition mechanisms, that actually there's significant opportunity as well. We see those technology opportunities exist. We think that there are a lot of them out there, and that really if the U.S. Wants to take advantage of those and make sure that those opportunities are happening here in the U.S., then having that kind of leadership here and putting in place the right policies to actualize that is really important. And that's, again, part of what we're trying to communicate up on the Hill, that you can do this. If you act now, we can get there. And if you do this the right way, in terms of using market-based mechanisms, but with some complementary policies and measures to get us over these technology and market humps, and we actually put in place the right financing structures that we can achieve some of these goals very cost effectively.
Okay. And I just want to follow up with one question, and we'll go back to the audience, but some of you who might have attended last month's For Greener Good program, it featured a new development in Abu Dhabi called Masdar, which is trying to position itself as an economic incubator of sustainable industry, and it incorporates a new $250 million campus of sustainable engineering by MIT, and it's attracted billions of dollars of investments from European banks. And right now, the buzzword of green-collar jobs is particularly prevalent on the campaign trail, with everyone, whether it's John McCain, Barack Obama, or Hillary Clinton, declaring that they will usher in a new era of green-collar jobs. And we obviously have a couple people up here who actually are technically in green-collar jobs, including Professor Hascher, who's hired presumably because of his environmental expertise. And I'm just curious as to what extent people think that this concept, how much potential does it have, and to what extent is it being oversold? I know that, in some cases we're really seeing its potential. I know John Doerr recently said that Silicon Valley should be renamed Solar Valley because of the there are more than 200 solar startups in Silicon Valley at this point. At the other point, there are clearly other areas of the United States, and I'm sure different areas in Europe that might have difficulty transitioning to those kinds of jobs. So I'm just interested if people could talk about that landscape. Would you like to take it?
I can speak to that a little bit, since you brought up John Doerr from the Silicon Valley, and the whole discussion that we had in California during the passage of these bills is how do we transition from an old economy based on fossil fuels to a new economy, and that transition is a challenge. And many progressive businesses sort of stepped up to the plate and began having a conversation with the public, which helps politicians, I suppose, make up their mind to do the right thing. And they were also articulating the cost of inaction, what it would cost their businesses, what it would cost society, what would it cost healthcare providers, what would it cost to water agencies as we try to transport water long distance in California. We're dependent on the Sierra Nevadas. What would be the cost to homeowners with insurance costs rising along our 1,100 miles of coastline? We also had a study done by the University of California at Berkeley looking at jobs across the spectrum. And, is the cement industry, if we can't come up with a different chemical compound to create cement, do they just leave and go to Nevada, still causing greenhouse gas emissions? Or what we're starting to see now that we put a cap in creating that market are startup companies that have come up with already innovative concepts and ideas sort of accomplish both objectives: keep jobs in California, expand on new jobs, whether it's in solar, or Iceland just opened an office in Los Angeles to expand geothermal activity. The excitement and interest in California right now through the venture capitalist community, from progressive business leaders who want to position their companies to be successful in the 21st century, and even labor, who was supportive, the labor community and labor unions supportive of the passage of this bill, talking about apprenticeship programs on all economic levels of the spectrum, providing jobs. We're losing our middle class in California. We see this new green economy as a perfectly wonderful option for creating new jobs for the 21st century. And I can't tell you about the excitement in the college campuses around the country, and particularly in California. They see this new society, and it's potentially a bright future, but the challenge is that transition. We're beginning a revolution here and doing things differently, and what is the most cost-effective way to do that? But also judging, when we're looking at costs, what is the cost of inaction and not doing anything?
And just on the jobs issue, Assemblywoman Pavley mentioned the training aspect is going to be really important, because we are talking about, again, new types of technologies, which will require new skills, new types of generating technologies, new types of end-use technologies, new types of automobiles, all those things. And so the worker training and retraining issues, I think, are really critical. And so as you look at national legislation, there's a recognition of that, and then there's also recognition that will require funding, that will require a commitment to help train a skilled workforce to meet these needs. And it's something that we're focused on at PG&E, and have actually started to create programs to work with our community colleges, our universities, and within our communities, at community-based organizations within the state, so that we can help train and have a skilled workforce. In terms of job creation, I think one thing I would point to, I'm not sure it's clear on the job creation, but as we're talking currently, what's pending in Congress, the energy tax issues in the energy tax bill, and looking at, for example, the investment tax credits and production tax credits. There was a study was done by some of the organizations that are advocating for the passage of those tax credits to look at, if those tax credits aren't extended, how many jobs are we going to lose? And they came out with a figure roughly of around 120,000 jobs that are there today that will be lost if we don't extend the ITC and the PTC, these tax credits. So just showing you that it's not a promise of future jobs, that there are jobs today, and a significant number of jobs dependent on some of these green technologies, these renewable technologies, and they exist. They're located throughout the country in places like Arkansas, Louisiana. They're not just in California. And so these are really important. These are important bills, and these are important provisions, because we need to really encourage these industries today so that they're there for us when we need to meet the challenges of tomorrow.
Yeah, I had a couple thoughts on this. These twin issues of whether this is really costly problem to address, and also the question about whether there can be these green-collar jobs. Google. Well, Google is a big company, but I didn't think it would bring that kind of reaction. Google has plans to invest in R&D to come up with a technology that will produce electricity using renewable energy that is cheaper than coal. Now, if they can do this, then the market will spread this technology. You won't need these punishments I mentioned before. The market itself will spread. The problem is that it may be that they can't do it, and it's also true that there's an awful lot of coal that's very cheap to get at. So the challenge is how you can really affect the technological transformation against when the market incentives aren't always going with you. And this is really what the challenge is. And I think people, if they think that this is going to be a very inexpensive problem, that means we should have already done a lot more about it than we have. And I think we really have to understand that to bring about a technological transformation worldwide is an unprecedented challenge. We've never done anything like this before. If there's one rhetorical example I could give you, which I think we can draw some inspiration from, it's John F. Kennedy's speech in Houston, Texas, when he was telling the nation that we were actually going to send men to the moon and return them to Earth before that particular decade was out. And if you read through the transcripts of that speech, which is an incredibly inspiring speech, he's very clear. He tells the American public that this will be costly. He tells us it'll be costly. He actually worked out how much it would cost for every man, woman, and child. He also said the benefits were a bit unclear. It wasn't just about beating the Soviets in the Cold War. It was about something much greater than this. It was really about trying to ennoble us as a nation. And I think we're going to need leadership that will really explain to the American public, but then even outside the United States, that this is our challenge. This is this generation's challenge, and we're going to do it even though it is not easy. We're going to do it even though it is not inexpensive.
And I just have a quick follow-up question, which is, are there people on the world stage, whether the people who are aspiring to the presidency of the United States or people overseas, who you feel are articulating that message and can fulfill that role?
It's very simple. There are some people who have spoken very eloquently about this issue. One example is Tony Blair, Prime Minister of Britain. The problem with Tony Blair is that Britain, a great country, is a small country. The only leader who could do this and make a difference is the leader of the United States. Now, the United States, by the way, for this particular issue, is not big enough. you have to start to think about immediately having the United States, Europe, Japan, China, India, all these countries, and even more after that, to play a part. So you need someone who can really galvanize global leadership, and that's why this challenge is much more complicated than putting a man on the moon. The inspiration, I think, needs to be similar, but you would need an extraordinary president of the United States who would stand up and say, this needs to be done, we are going to do it, and we're going to do it even though it will be costly, and we're going to get other countries to do it with us.
And actually, just one quick question for Professor Hascher. I wanted to ask you that, obviously, to what extent is Europe ahead of the United States in incorporating sustainable elements into their design and construction process? Kind of the buildings you've shown us, are these very few exceptions? Is this really where they're moving? And I'm wondering how receptive Europeans are to this. When you tell someone you don't get your own desk, I can tell you in the Washington Post, certainly that would be a very controversial thing if you said you couldn't go back to your same desk day after day. And so I'm curious of how much you feel that it is the people who are working in these buildings who are embracing what you are doing, or is it more the decisions of the people who are commissioning the buildings, who are searching for the kind of designs that you are pushing?
The people accept, which work in these houses, they accept the houses, and they feel much more comfort because they can open the window by himself, and they regulate the climate. Perhaps I have to tell one thing. If we have an air conditioning, we have always the same temperature in the room and humidity. And if you are in the nature, there is a wide spread in this theme. And people like this. If you are a woman, normally you feel quicker cold than if you are a man. If you are older, you perhaps like other temperatures. So it's much more easier to regulate all the things by yourself. And if you do this, you can save energies. I will tell one example. We also designed, not built, but we designed a former terminal for the airport of Schönefeld. And there, the people first wanted an air conditioning because it was near to the
airplanes.
Airplanes.
Yeah.
And it was loud and so on. And then we got a solution with the second facade in glass where you could ventilate inside. If you have an air conditioning, it is by law that we have to keep 26 degrees Celsius. If you have no air conditioning, it can up to 32, 33. It's possible. And so we asked the people, what do you prefer? Do you prefer 26 degrees, so you need an air conditioning, or do you prefer to open the window? And the people, although the Gewerkschaft, although the union agreed to open the window.
Interesting.
And you must discuss it.
Excellent. Okay, do we have other questions from the audience? One right up there.
This is a question about cap-and-trade systems. In general, it's been in the media for a long, long time. A number of our panel members have already mentioned it. Assemblywoman Pavley mentioned that a cap-and-trade system was able, to create a market that wasn't there before, that fostered some innovation. But then earlier, Professor Barrett mentioned that this eventual goal of getting down to zero emissions. And so my question is, about short-term versus long-term. Does a cap-and-trade system, by its very nature, create a right to pollute, and thus any future lowering of that cap, is that considered then a takings or some sort of eminent domain of taking of these pollution credits that you are cutting into this market that has then been created as a right now? How does that system work, and can you just help explain that to us?
I'm going to give a real short response and let the economists respond to all that. I want to make it clear, we put a cap on emissions. There was nothing trading in the bill. We put a cap on emissions. John Doerr and all the venture capitalists, they said the cap on emissions creates that market. We're rolling them back to 1990 levels. There is no discussion of trading. We're saying through the implementation of this process over the next 4 to 10 years or so, market-based mechanisms will be discussed through a complementary approach of probably a regulatory approach and maybe using auctions or maybe using allowances or other kinds of options. We're looking at them. Do they really work? Can they be verified? Can California by itself engage in a trading program? So right now, California's bill is strictly a cap. That is creating the market. It is sending that signal to all these new companies, especially the investors in renewables and alternative fuels and low carbon fuels, that California is open for business. And so it is not a trade. The presidential candidates all talk about cap and trade. We have a cap in place and a reduction of emissions that can be verified and quantified. Stay tuned on whether there'll be market-based mechanisms.
Yeah, just maybe a quick comment on this. These tradable permit systems can be very helpful for a lot of reasons. Economically and politically, they can be very helpful for getting regulations adopted. The problem with climate change, in one perspective, is really a property rights problem in the sense that we have established property rights to the atmosphere that say that the atmosphere belongs to everyone, which means really it doesn't belong to anyone. And so every country throws too much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And this is the fundamental problem really we're trying to grapple with in a variety of ways. So I think creating a property right is not necessarily a bad thing. But the property right is not something that should last in perpetuity. I mean, it's basically we're talking about a public issue, and we're talking about the public interest. So you actually are granting a right that would last for some period of time, and you'd be very clear about that. For climate, you also need to make sure that you don't get locked in, which is part of what I think you're concerned about. So we don't take those first easier steps and then stop there. We need to keep the system moving forward, and particularly need to build in what I would call positive feedback so that as we do more to address the problem, it becomes even easier for us to do yet more again, and so on. And one way to do this is to not just limit emissions and cap them, but also to do other things. If you really think of this problem as requiring a technological revolution, which I believe it needs, then that means you're going to need to also give incentives with the generation of new knowledge about how to come up with new technologies, how to apply them, how to use them, and how to diffuse them. And if you couple a system where you've got the pull incentives for reducing emissions through things like caps, with or without trading, with push incentives because you've got innovation and knowledge coming up from behind, throwing ideas at how we could do even a better job. It's really that combination that we're looking for. There's not one instrument that's going to address the climate problem.
Okay, do we have other question? We have a bunch over here, so if you could choose one of the ones over here.
And I think we have time for about one more question and then some final thoughts.
Sure.
You've addressed the issue of climate change in developed countries. However, there is the issue of climate change in developing countries. When you are worried about survival today and tomorrow and feeding your family today and tomorrow, the issues become very different. Yet the people in these countries contribute significantly to global climate change, and they have to be part of the solution. Please address, if you would, the role of humanitarian care and concerns with respect to global climate change. And where I'm going with this is how those get addressed so that the issue of global climate change can be resolved. Thank you.
Okay. And so if people could speak to that, and I think how to incorporate developing countries into this effort, particularly given what they have at stake, both in the near term in terms of these kind of survival issues, and then clearly in the long term, given that every scientific study shows how developing countries will be disproportionately affected by global warming.
Well, especially the countries that are so economically devastated. I mean, the adaptation cost will be tremendous, and Kyoto has a process. to provide money and support for adaptations in those kinds of countries. As far as China and India, one thing many of our businessmen are looking at as the economic opportunity is a way to export these new technologies and things to assist China and India in creating and developing cleaner technologies. NRDC, for example, has opened an office in Beijing and are working with the Beijing government. When we have a president of the United States that takes this issue seriously and makes it a priority in his or her administration, that'll send a strong signal, and the United States is in a really has a unique potential to use our innovative spirit and technology and accomplishments to provide some of the solutions in these other countries, but I don't think they're going to take us seriously until we go into this leadership role. An engineer from China once told me at a conference, he said, you know, if California hadn't required a catalytic converter in their automobiles, we wouldn't be using that today in China. So there is some opportunity to work with these other countries that are developing so quickly, and we're going to see some of the problems associated with not only global warming, but air pollution and co-pollutants, I think, as the Olympics come to fruition in August.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned developing countries. First of all, they are, as you said, they're a big part of the problem in the sense that the large, fast-growing developing countries are adding tremendously to greenhouse gas concentrations. And, you know, we made a mistake in 1996. Earlier administration actually agreed that the poorer countries should be basically let off the hook and not have to cut back on emissions at all, and that the richer countries should do it. The reason that was a mistake is that what you needed to do was to get these countries, before they were propelled in their development, to actually get on a different development track. We don't want them to actually get on our path and then cut back from there, but actually develop in a different way than we did, and for us to really catch up over time with that new kind of development path. And unfortunately, I think that opportunity is maybe not missed, but we've certainly missed an awful lot of it. You know, China has been adding something like 1 to 2 coal-fired power plants a week. This is a tremendous, these plants last 40 or 50 years. So this is an incredible legacy we're really leaving for the future. This has to be addressed. Another thing about poorer countries, though, are the different kinds of countries, not the ones who are causing the problem, but the ones that are more likely to be the biggest victims from climate change. The poorer countries located near the equator have a lot of things going against them. One is they're already, in a sense, too hot. So as the temperature warms, they're going to be even warmer. They rely on much more on climate-sensitive sectors for their development, agriculture especially. So that's another thing, making them more vulnerable. But then perhaps most importantly, a lot of these countries that have failed to develop because they lack the institutions that will support development. Those same institutions are the institutions we need to call upon to address the challenges from climate change as they unfold. So these countries are in a particularly vulnerable spot. Now, in Bali, this issue was raised, and the richer countries have already acknowledged, in fact, they did in the Framework Convention from 1992, that they have an obligation to assist poorer countries. But you know, that obligation, as it's been expressed so far, is a collective obligation, and the problem with collective obligations is that no one's particularly individually responsible for fulfilling the obligation. So we don't know how much will be offered in terms of assistance, and we don't know who will be responsible for what portion of that assistance. But it's absolutely crucial that we totally rethink the whole nature of development, because you both have to develop in such a way that you're not going to be adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. You also have to develop in such a way that you're reducing the vulnerabilities of these countries to climate change. And remember that there are different kinds of climate change. There's gradual climate change, kind of slow change in terms of temperature and so on, sea level. And then there could be abrupt and catastrophic climate change. And you need to have a economic and social political system that is suited to this future kind of world, and we currently don't have that. So the challenges for the richer countries offer assistance to the developing countries are huge.
And Professor Hascher, maybe because we're really almost out of time, if you could just end, and I'm wondering if you could speak to, again, obviously you've been doing these amazing designs in Germany, and what do you think your vision is for the broader world, including some developing countries, to be able to adapt some of these innovative architectural techniques in their own countries? Could you speak a little to, how the movement that has started in Europe can expand worldwide?
I think if we show what we can do with these other means, and we practice this in our countries, the other countries will accept it, and they will follow us. And we have to make big efforts, especially also to develop the techniques. If I think you spoke of the warmer areas where the poor people live, especially the techniques by cooling by sun. There is enormous potential still now, and there we have to put our strength to invent new solutions. And in the last 5 years, there we had a big increase of conditioning by solar energy.
Excellent. Well, I think that that's a good note to end on. So we will be having an informal reception afterwards, which everybody is welcome to go. But if everyone could join me in thanking our panelists for their participation.